Over its 20-year duration, the World of Warcraft has kept getting bigger and bigger. Whether it was through major patches, updates, or entire expansions, MMOs are games that have to keep progressing and growing to fulfill the living, breathing worlds which they are supposed to be. And a core part of any MMO's growth in size will be the new zones for players to explore. Zones are like the building blocks which everything is placed upon, from gathering, questing, dungeons to raids. Everything takes place within the zones of the game, so we're going to need a lot of zones for a game that's been around this long. And while some of the zones in the game are hallmarks of incredible world building and fantasy creation, others are, well, not quite as well remembered, shall we say. And that's what I want to talk about today, what for me was the worst zone of every WoW expansion so far. For this, we're going to be going in order of zone preference from least bad to what I consider avoid if possible, but I do have to pick one zone per expansion of World of Warcraft, and trust me, some of these were really hard choices to make. We will begin with World of Warcraft's 4th expansion, and soon to be one which we will be revisiting in Classic, Mists of Pandaria. Now, to be honest, MOP didn't really have a bad zone pretty much at all, which makes it rather difficult to pick here since I have to. But if I do have to choose one, I think it'll be the Krasarang Wilds. This is a zone towards the south of Pandaria that you'll get to a bit later when leveling, but one that's always at the same time felt a bit optional to me, and that you don't really need to be there for all that long in order to get to level 90. So what were the problems with it? Well, for me the zone could feel a bit claustrophobic at times with all the trees which are there, and there are small rivers everywhere and just bits of water that you could accidentally run into. There also weren't any raids or dungeons, so oftentimes you just didn't really need to be here all that much. And I do remember some of the quests were rather annoying to complete as well. All in all though, not a terrible zone by any stretch of the imagination, but if I've got to pick one, that's what I'm going for Mists of Pandaria. Next up is the entry from Legion. Now, Legion as a whole probably had some of the best zones we have ever seen in World of Warcraft, and were it not for the content added in later patches, I'm really not overly sure what I'd be picking here, but for Legion my choice will be the Antoran Wastes. Added towards the end of the expansion, this zone was part of us going to Argus to confront the Legion directly, and as you might imagine, Argus was not really a very nice place to be, so in some ways I guess Blizzard did a good job here. I think Crocun and the Antoran Wastes are somewhat similar here, in that they both have the same kind of landscapes, high mob density, no flying allowed, lots of obstacles to get over or around, and so on. There were plenty of good reasons to go there though, from the daily quests, the new raids or dungeons, and of course the invasion points which allow players to very easily farm up legendaries towards the end of the expansion. Overall for Legion there were so many good zones that anything that wasn't outright exceptional did end up standing out a bit. Next we're heading to Battle for Azeroth, a less liked expansion by the community, but one which I think most would agree had many fantastic zones to play through, quest in, and explore. At the start of the expansion, each faction had an island with 3 different zones on that they would play through, and in my opinion all of these starting zones were great. In fact, similar to Legion, it's a piece of content which was added towards the end of the expansion that will be my pick here, and that will be for Mechagon Island. I reckon a lot of people would have gone for Nazjatar here instead, but I at least found that zone interesting with its different areas and content. Mechagon Island in comparison though just felt as though something was missing. It's supposed to be this island of super mechanical advancement and machines, but for me it just felt more like an island with loads of random bits of metal placed everywhere, and that at times it was a bit empty. Much like the previous zone, I don't think it was super bad by any means, but that would be my pick for BFA. Next up is the War Within, and I know we haven't seen everything from this expansion yet, I'm well aware, but in the other videos I've done similar to this I have included it, so I'm going to do it here as well. At the end of the day maybe my opinion will change between now and the end of the expansion, maybe it won't, who knows. Either way, with how the expansion has gone so far, it has several very strong zones, each of which could be someone's favourite with very good reason, which makes it pretty difficult to pick a least liked one. But that is the objective of the video, so I'm going to give it a go. So for the War Within, my picks so far would be Ashkahet. First up, I'm not overly a fan of underground zones when we have dragon riding. It just feels a bit confined given how fast we can move around the map, almost like we're being held back a bit. The second reason is it's trying to be Suramar 2.0. Now Suramar could legitimately be one of the best zones ever made in World of Warcraft. A visually amazing elven city with a progressive story over several patches where you couldn't fly at the start, filled with tons of content. Now the City of Threads within Ashkahet for me just doesn't match up. You can fly above any potential threats, it has much darker themes which, although fitting, just aren't as appealing to me, and to be honest I don't really find Nerubians to be a very compelling ally within the game. Suramar was dealing with Nightborn elves in secret out of fear of their rebellion. In Ashkahet you kind of just fly up and start chatting with some giant spiders who are hanging around. It doesn't have that same element of risk that Suramar had in my opinion. So that's for me why Ashkahet has to be the pick for the War Within. Next is Dragonflight, and it's in quite a similar place to my pick for the War Within due to mixing an underground zone with dragon riding, so it won't come as a surprise that my choice is the Zaralet Caverns. Similar reasons to Ashkahet, but it did feel a bit more enclosed at times and that there was even less room to maneuver around. Dragonflight was another expansion with overall strong zone design though, so not really too much to add on to this, but that is my pick here. The next few, if you have noticed so far, are going to start going backwards in expansions once again, but now we have the entry from Warlords of Draenor, which doesn't really feel like an earlier version of WoW, but on November 13th this year, it will be 10 years old. Scary, right? As much as Warlords of Draenor regularly gets ragged on by the community for having about as much content as the average vanilla boss had mechanics, one thing it definitely did right was its zones, and the reimagined Draenor was really something to behold, which makes me kind of surprised in myself that it even finds itself towards the middle to lower end of this list. But the zone that didn't quite pay off in Warlords of Draenor for me was Tanaan Jungle. So Tanaan Jungle was what I would call this expansion's Timeless Isle. Of course, the Timeless Isle was first done in Mists of Pandaria, and for me that basically means a zone with tons of stuff to do and to collect, from achievements to mounts, pet battles, currencies and so on. But for me Tanaan Jungle was just not really a place I wanted to go back to again and again. I think mainly due to the colour scheme, the amount of obstacles that were always in front of you, and to be honest I also reckon it was partially because aside from the raid or PvP, you were going to be spending a lot of time in this place on your way to the next expansion. The same could be said for the Timeless Isle of course, but again it's just a preference thing as a whole. Next up is Cataclysm, and I bet you are waiting for this one. If there is anything overly controversial in this video, this may just be the one. So Cataclysm, as we all know, is the expansion known for having a certain zone which people either really love or hate. This is of course Vashj'ir, World of Warcraft's first and probably only ever fully underwater zone. And it is not the worst Cataclysm zone in my opinion. Not the best either, it would be somewhere in the middle for me. I think ultimately it was an interesting idea, but having that extra vertical movement axis was just too different from the normal format. So ultimately I would understand if they never wanted to commit to making another zone like this. But for Cataclysm, from all the new zones in the expansion, I'm probably going to have to pick the island of Tol Barad. The reasons are that it's not really connected to anything in the world, you kind of just teleport there from a random portal. It's got a very bland appearance. I mean, it is a giant prison on an island in the middle of nowhere, so objective complete I guess, but still. The main reasons to be there were for the dailies, which were pretty simple to do. After that you had the raid of course, and then the PvP and the battle for Tol Barad. And I remember the battle for Tol Barad was pretty bad back in the day, and now having redone it in Cataclysm Classic, I can once again confirm it is still pretty bad. A rotation of a mass of unorganized players between several different bases which you are supposed to hold, where more than half the time the game ends after a few minutes because nobody wants to run the timer all the way down on defense, they just want the attackers to win so they can get out of there. Now we move on to Vanilla, which, I mean sure it's not an expansion, but it's a version of World of Warcraft, and a pretty huge one at that. Now without a doubt Vanilla has some amazing zones, but in that massive world it created, there are some which aren't quite as good. The pick for me, and I think this is just about the most basic pick for Vanilla, but it's that for a reason, is Desolace. I mean, come on, they made a massive flat grey bunch of nothing and said, wow, this place is so Desolate. Why don't we just name it after that? Now, to be fair, Desolate is a fairly good leveling zone for both Horde and Alliance if you know how to navigate it and pick up all the quests where needed. And if you're using a questing guide, they're always going to send you here. The issues for me are, well, first of all, the appearance of the place, as I've already mentioned. It's not a very nice place to be for too long. Second is that it hits those levels just before you get a mount, so you have to run this whole place on foot. This means you get a really good opportunity to soak in the sights of Desolus, such as the Kodo Graveyard or the wildlife of the zone. Speaking of that, why is mob density so bizarrely high in some places, on top of having mobs which have crazy level ranges barely a few hundred yards apart? Oftentimes in vanilla, I'll opt for a few dungeons instead of coming here, as it can be an optional zone if you want it to be, and I am thankful for that. Next up is another old expansion, in fact, the first expansion, the Burning Crusade. So I think for most people this is a close one between Hellfire Peninsula and Blade's Edge Mountain. I think out of the two zones, however, Hellfire Peninsula isn't as bad. It is the first zone you're coming into for the Burning Crusade, you start to upgrade your gear, maybe you do anyway, and there are dungeons which are great to do and easy to access as soon as you're there, and then afterwards you get to carry on into Zangarmarsh quite soon, which means for me my pick for TBC will go to Blade's Edge Mountains. One of the problems with TBC leveling is that it was always very linear, so on your regular playthrough you're going to have to experience the wonders of Blade's Edge Mountains, which means having to go up and down the valley in the centres several times in a row to hand in and complete some quests. There are several quests with weird items, especially from that gnome area, Alliance players will know, that aren't exactly intuitive to use, and whilst you're there you're not going to have flying yet either. All in all, this makes it a less than fun place to be. Fortunately, you don't have to finish the entire zone to be high enough level to progress onwards, but getting to Blade's Edge Mountain for me is always a short visit, which means the second to last entry is from Wrath of the Lich King. Wrath had some absolute banger zones. Howling Fjord, despite the incredibly annoying quests early on, still remains a favourite for me. Sholazar Basin is great, and of course the good old Grizzly Hills. And there's so many good zones that the ones which aren't as good really end up standing out. Fortunately though, by the time Wrath came out, there were more quests in zones than experience needed to level cap, so you could basically skip entire zones and be just fine. Oh, and we also had heirlooms and bonus XP effects, those help too. But the zone I'm talking about here for Wrath is Gundrak. Gundrak has one singular redeeming feature, and that is the Amphitheatre of Anguish. It's always fun to do, very worthwhile, loads of XP, great reward at the end, but it's just not enough by itself. Gundrak has a dark and gloomy atmosphere, mobs which are strangely just far enough away from one another to be inconvenient, but above all it has the Drakuru questline. This questline is the answer to the question, do you want to not play your character and do vehicle quests for the next 90 minutes? If yes, I have great news for you. I can't think of a single questline in this entire game which was worse to do. When doing Lawmaster of Northrend, it was without a doubt the lowest point at leveling in the game for me, and for the majority of my characters in Wrath, I just did a few quests at the start of Gundrak which were well laid out, and then I'd only ever come back here for the dungeons. Which means in first place or last place, depending on how you're looking at it, is the zone where I really never want to go, and that is from the Shadowlands. And I bet you already know where I'm gonna pick. That's right, it's quite literally hell on Azeroth, the Moor. I mean, technically the Moor should be the last place anyone would want to be, so it being a terrible place is Blizzard having done a good job? With some of these other zones that I wasn't a fan of, sometimes you could skip them or you didn't really have to be there, they were just there for extra stuff that you could do within the game. This was not the case with the Moor, as it was directly tied to a number of progression points for your character, so you had to go to the Moor, and at the start you couldn't even mount. In fact, do you remember early on in Shadowlands, people would put war mode on just outside of Venari's Refuge and gank people for the weekly quest, so Blizzard had to give everyone invisibility so you could actually get out into the zone. What a great start. But then you ventured out into this rather large zone on foot, and it wasn't the case that you couldn't fly, you straight up couldn't mount here at the start of the expansion. They added mounts sometime later in a patch though. There were all the hallmarks of inconvenience too: high mob density, verticality that could make getting across the zone difficult, and an all too fitting colour palette of black, grey and red. For what it was almost so bad it was good in a weird way, but the moor was one of the reasons that I checked out of Shadowlands at a very early stage, and really, I don't think I missed much. But those are just my choices, the worst zone from each expansion of World of Warcraft so far. Let me know, what are your worst ones? Do you agree with what I went for here, or are any of these not so bad in your opinion? Also, do you want to see a best zone type video too? I could definitely make that happen. But as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I shall see you all in the next one very soon.